You don't live here anymore. The words landed before I even understood what I was looking at. My suitcase was sitting on the porch. My own suitcase, packed and zipped, standing upright on the front step like someone had placed it there carefully and deliberately. The house behind my brother still smelled like funeral flowers. The white lilies that had been delivered that morning were visible through the hallway, arranged in a tall vase on the side table where my mother's photographs had always stood. Andrew stood in the doorway holding a folder. He looked calm, almost bored, like this was a meeting he had scheduled and was now simply completing. "There's no inheritance for you," he said. "Dad made that clear." I laughed. One short, confused sound. "That's not funny." He didn't smile. He reached into the folder and produced a check. He held it out toward me the way you hold something out to someone you've already decided doesn't deserve an explanation. "Take it and go," he said. My chest went tight. The kind of tight that happens when your body understands something before your mind does. Something was wrong. Not grief wrong, not funeral day wrong. Something deeper and more deliberate than that. My name is Clara Whitmore. I was 27 years old when my brother erased me from my own family in under 5 minutes. And I didn't even know yet that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The door closed. I stood on the porch holding the check in both hands. My fingers were shaking slightly. I could hear Andrew's voice through the wall. Light, conversational. The sound of someone picking up a normal evening after a minor interruption. Relatives were still inside. I could hear the low murmur of other voices responding to him. I knocked again. Hard enough that my knuckles stung. No one came. I stepped back and looked at the check. The amount was small. Insultingly, deliberately small. The kind of number that said, "This is what I think you're worth and I'm being generous." It wasn't a share of anything. It was a dismissal with a signature at the bottom. I looked at my suitcase. Someone had packed it from inside the house and placed it outside before I arrived. Which meant this wasn't a reaction to something I had said at the funeral. This wasn't a moment of grief turning into anger. The suitcase had been packed in advance. The check had been prepared in advance. Andrew had stood at the funeral and hugged me and said we would figure everything out together. He had said it with his arm around my shoulders and his eyes calm and steady. The whole time this had already been planned. I stood on the porch in the fading afternoon light and asked myself the question that would drive everything that came next. How long had he been preparing this? I needed to go back through the day in my head because nothing was making sense in real time. That morning Andrew had been perfect. Composed in the way people admire at funerals. Not broken but clearly feeling it, moving through the service with quiet dignity. He had greeted relatives at the door. He had arranged the order of speakers. He had chosen the music and the readings and stood at the front with his hands folded while people said things about our father that were mostly true. He had hugged me outside the chapel. A real hug, full arms, chin over my shoulder, the kind that takes a moment to release. "We'll figure everything out together," he had said. "Don't worry about any of that yet." I had believed him. Because what kind of person plans what he was planning while burying their father? What kind of person holds their grieving sister and says don't worry while the check is already written and the suitcase is already mentally packed? Andrew, apparently. I thought about the drive back from the service. He had ridden separately. Said he needed to check on the catering. I had helped my aunt with her coat and talked to cousins I hadn't seen in 2 years and arrived at the house thinking we were all just getting through a hard day together. Something had changed between the chapel and the front door. Or nothing had changed at all. It had always been this. Andrew had been precise about one thing and vague about everything else. That was what I kept coming back to as I sat in my car in the driveway, unable to make myself drive away just yet. He had said, "Dad updated the will." 4 words. No document shown. No solicitor present. No reading in a formal setting with witnesses and explanations. Just Andrew standing in a doorway, saying it like it was already settled fact. And the people inside had believed him. That was the part one couldn't move past. The relatives who were still in there, eating sandwiches and drinking tea and speaking to Andrew in normal, sympathetic tones. They had heard those 4 words and accepted them. Nobody had asked to see the document. Nobody had said, wait, let's hear from both of them. Nobody had called the solicitor on the spot to confirm. They had simply adjusted, rearranged their understanding of the situation to fit what Andrew had told them, and then continued the afternoon as if I had never had a valid claim to anything. He hadn't just cut me off financially. He had done something more sophisticated than that. He had presented a version of events to the people around us, casually and confidently and before I arrived, and they had absorbed it without question. He hadn't just taken control of the estate. He had taken control of the story. Why didn't anyone question it? Because the person telling the story was calm and organized and had a folder. And because I wasn't in the room when he told it. I called 3 relatives that evening from the car park of a petrol station 20 minutes from the house. My Aunt Phyllis first. She answered warmly and then went careful very quickly. The warmth retreated like something being pulled back on a string. She said things like, it's a difficult time and family decisions are complicated, and I'm sure your father had his reasons. I asked her directly. Had she seen the will herself? Had anyone? He paused. Then she said, Andrew told us everything. He had the documents. I called my cousin Felix next. Shorter conversation. He said he didn't want to get in the middle and hoped things would settle down. I called my aunt on my father's side. Auntie Bev, who had always been the honest one in the family, the one who said what she actually thought. She was quiet for a moment after I explained what had happened. Then she said, Clara, love. Andrew spoke to most of us this morning. Before the service. He said your father had updated everything and that you'd been difficult about it. Difficult. He had told them I was difficult. He had prepared them in advance to receive my reaction as the predictable behavior of a difficult person. So whatever I said now would already have been framed for them. My confusion was just what Andrew had predicted. My objection was just what Andrew had warned them about. He hadn't just cut me off. He had rewritten who I was before I even had the chance to speak. My father's last words to me stayed in my head all evening like a song you can't stop hearing. It had been 4 days before he died. I had sat beside his bed in the afternoon when the light came through the curtains at that low winter angle that made everything feel like a painting. He had been tired but clear-eyed, and we had talked about ordinary things for most of the visit. Then, near the end when I stood to leave, he had reached out and held my wrist. You'll be okay, he had said. I made sure of it. I had taken it as comfort. The way a father says don't worry without wanting to get into details. I had squeezed his hand and told him I loved him and driven home thinking about what to cook for dinner, because the mind finds ordinary things to hold on to when larger ones are too heavy. But now I sat in a budget motel room that smelled like cleaning product and old carpet, and those 6 words would not stop turning over. You'll be okay. I made sure of it. That did not match what Andrew had told me on the porch. That didn't match a will that left me with a small check and an instruction to leave. My father had not been a dramatic man. He did not say things he didn't mean, and he did not make assurances he hadn't backed up with action. What if Andrew was lying? I called the estate solicitor the following morning. His name was Mr. Hargrove. I had met him once, 2 years earlier, when my father had updated some documents and wanted both of us present for the signing. He had seemed thorough. The organized kind of professional who kept records the way other people kept promises. His receptionist put me through without much delay. When I told him who I was, there was a pause. Not a brief pause. Long one. The kind that has something inside it. Miss Whitmore, he said carefully. I thought Andrew had already spoken with you. He handed me a check and told me to leave, I said. Another pause. Shorter this time. I see, he said. Just that. I see. In a tone that told me his understanding of the situation had just been rearranged by something I had said. I asked him directly whether he could tell me the current status of my father's estate. He said he would need to review what he was permitted to share without a formal meeting. He said there were protocols around estate disclosure. He said things in careful, measured language that told me he was someone who chose his words precisely and was currently choosing them very precisely. But before he ended the call, he said something I hadn't expected. There are additional documents tied to the estate that haven't yet been fully processed. Additional documents that Andrew had never mentioned. I called Mr. Hargrove back the next morning and asked to schedule a formal meeting. He agreed without hesitation, which itself told me something. If Andrew had fully controlled the situation and there was nothing to discuss, a solicitor would have suggested I speak to my brother directly. Instead, he gave me an appointment for the following afternoon. In the meantime, he confirmed certain things on the call. Yes, there was a will. Yes, it had been updated. He couldn't share the specific contents without the formal meeting, but he confirmed that the estate process was ongoing and that not everything had been finalized. Then he said it again. The thing from the previous call. There are additional documents tied to the estate. I assumed Andrew would have explained them to you. Apparently he did not. I asked him to describe what he meant by additional documents. He chose his words very carefully. He said that in complex estates, there were sometimes supplementary instruments, letters, instructions, formal addenda, that accompanied the primary will and carried their own legal weight. He said, "These documents are part of the estate record. They have not been disclosed to all relevant parties." I sat with that for a moment. Andrew hadn't just told me there was no inheritance. He had given me a check and shut the door. He had not mentioned a solicitor appointment. He had not explained any process. He had presented a conclusion without showing me how it was reached. And somewhere in Mr. Hargrove's filing cabinet, there were documents Andrew had apparently decided I didn't need to see. While I waited for the meeting with Mr. Hargrove, I tried to access the things I had always been able to access. My father had maintained a shared family drive for important documents. Insurance records, household information, a folder of scanned certificates and old photographs he had digitized over the years. He had set it up 3 years ago and shared access with both of us. When I opened my laptop and tried to log in, I got an access error. I tried again. Same result. I checked the shared family email account we had used for household admin, the one my father had set up so that both Andrew and I could manage correspondence about the house when he was less mobile. I tried the cloud storage where we had backed up family documents after a hard drive failure 2 years ago. Or rather, not gone, reorganized. The folder structure had been changed. My access credentials no longer worked. Andrew hadn't done this today or yesterday. Changing access to multiple systems simultaneously required planning and time. He had gone through every shared digital space that connected me to the family's records and removed me from all of them. Not after I arrived at the porch. Not in a reaction. Before. I sat at the small desk in the motel room and looked at the laptop screen and felt the full shape of what had happened settle over me like a weight. He hadn't just taken control of the estate. He had systematically erased the trail. I drove past the house 2 days after the porch. I didn't stop. I drove slowly and looked and kept going, the way you do when you want information without making your presence into an event. The locks had been changed. I could see it from the street. The new hardware on the front door was different from what I remembered. Brighter. More modern. Through the front window I could see movement. Not relatives this time. Men in work clothes carrying things. A van was parked on the road just past the driveway. Not a moving truck exactly, but the kind of van that carries flat-packed shelving and equipment for reorganizing spaces. My father had been gone for less than a week. Andrew was already restructuring the house. I pulled around the corner and sat for a moment. There was something specifically chilling about the speed of it. Grief usually slows people down. Even people who aren't particularly sad. The logistics of a death, the paperwork, the arrangements, the sheer number of things that need to be handled, generally force a certain pace on proceedings. Andrew wasn't at that pace. Andrew was moving like someone who had been preparing for a sprint and had finally heard the starting signal. The locks changed immediately. The digital access removed in advance. The relatives briefed before the funeral. The check already written. He had been building this for weeks. Maybe longer. Why was he moving so fast? The only reason someone moves that fast is because they know something is coming and they want to be finished before it arrives. Mrs. Okonkwo lived in the house directly across from my father's. She had been there for over a decade and had known my father well enough to call him by his first name and wave at him from her garden on Sunday mornings. She flagged me down when I drove past again the following day. I hadn't planned to stop, but she was standing at her gate with purpose, and something in her expression told me she had been waiting for this opportunity. I pulled over and got out. She glanced once toward my father's house, then back at me. She lowered her voice slightly even though we were the only people on the pavement. "There were people here last week," she said. "Before your father passed." I went still. "What kind of people?" I asked. "Men with a van. Similar to that one." She nodded toward the vehicle still parked near the house. "They came twice. Your brother let them in." "When exactly?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Wednesday and Thursday. Your father went to hospital on the Friday." I processed that carefully. Wednesday and Thursday of the previous week. My father had still been home on those days, though very unwell. Andrew had let strangers into the house while my father was still alive and barely mobile. "Do you know what they were doing?" I asked. She shook her head. "I only saw them going in and out. But they carried things. Boxes mostly." I paused. I thought it was strange at the time. So did I. Andrew hadn't started planning after the funeral. He had started before our father was even gone. Mr. Hargrove's office was on the second floor of a building near the high street. Quiet. Lined with pale wood shelving and files arranged in a system that looked like it hadn't changed in 20 years. He offered me tea and I accepted, and we sat across a proper desk rather than at the side table he had probably used for less formal meetings. He had the manner of a man who had thought carefully about how this conversation should go and had decided that honesty, delivered gently, was the correct approach. He confirmed the basics first. Yes, there was a will, updated 14 months ago. Yes, Andrew had been in contact with the office. Yes, the estate process had been initiated. Then he set down his pen and looked at me directly. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to tell you something I should perhaps have raised with both of you simultaneously. There is a secondary clause in the estate documentation that your brother didn't include when he spoke to me about the process." I leaned forward slightly. "What clause?" I asked. He folded his hands on the desk. His expression was careful. The expression of a professional who had realized, somewhere between my first phone call and this meeting, that he had been given an incomplete picture of the situation and was now correcting his own course. "It pertains to the conditions under which either beneficiary's claim can be affected by their conduct during the estate process," he said. He paused. "Your brother didn't mention it because it applies directly to him." Mr. Hargrove explained the clause slowly and clearly, the way you explain something important to someone who needs to understand it fully before they respond. The estate documentation included a conduct provision. My father had insisted on it during the most recent will update. Mr. Hargrove said my father had been explicit. He wanted a clause that addressed the possibility of either child attempting to misrepresent or withhold information about the estate from the other. The clause stated that if either beneficiary was found to have concealed material information, manipulated estate documents, or misrepresented the terms of the will to the other party or to third parties, their claim could be subject to formal review and potential revision. I sat very still. Andrew had told me there was no inheritance for me. He had not shown me the will. He had not arranged a joint meeting with the solicitor. He had handed me a check, told me my father had made his wishes clear, and closed the door. He had told relatives I had been difficult. He had briefed them before the funeral. He had removed my digital access before the death had even been formally processed. He had withheld information. He had misrepresented the terms. He had done exactly what the clause was designed to address. I looked at Mr. Hargrove. "Can he be held to that clause?" I asked quietly. "If the conduct can be demonstrated, he said carefully. Then yes. He may have disqualified himself from the sole control he has assumed. The question was how to prove it. I spent the next 4 days building a timeline. Not from memory alone. From evidence. Dates, records, confirmations. The kinds of details that don't rely on anyone's word against anyone else's. I went through my phone and pulled every text exchange I'd had with Andrew in the 6 weeks before my father's death. His messages had been normal for most of that period. Then in the final 10 days, there was a noticeable shift. He started asking questions about specific items in the house. My father's filing cabinet, the location of certain documents, whether I knew if Dad had a storage key. At the time I had answered without thinking. He was my brother, and we were both managing a deteriorating situation, and his questions seemed practical. Now those questions had a different shape. I pulled the digital access removal records. I couldn't see inside Andrew's actions directly, but I had the timestamps showing when my credentials had stopped working. 3 of the accounts had been locked within 48 hours of my father being admitted to hospital. Before the death. Before the funeral. Before any estate process had formally begun. Mrs. Okonkwo had confirmed visits on Wednesday and Thursday of the preceding week. I found an email in my own inbox from 2 months earlier, Andrew asking me casually whether I had ever looked at Dad's filing cabinet in the study. I had replied that I hadn't. Looking back, that question wasn't casual at all. The pattern was forming. I needed one more piece to make it solid. Mr. Hargrove called me on a Thursday morning with a particular steadiness in his voice that told me something had shifted in his office. He asked me to come in that afternoon. When I arrived, he was already at the desk. There was a document in front of him. Not the will. Something smaller. A single folded page inside a plain envelope, sealed with wax that had been stamped rather than signed. Formal. Deliberate. He looked up when I sat down. During my review of the complete estate file, he said, I found something that had been placed in a secondary folder attached to the estate instructions. I don't believe Andrew was aware it existed, or if he was, he chose not to mention it. He paused. Given the clause we discussed, that omission may itself be significant. He slid the envelope across the desk. This is a notarized letter from your father, he said. It was placed with me directly by him during his last formal appointment here, 2 months ago. He asked that it be held separately and given to both children together at the appropriate time. He met my eyes. Andrew did not facilitate that meeting. My hands were not entirely steady when I picked up the envelope. The wax seal had my father's initials pressed into it. I looked at Mr. Hargrove. He nodded once. I broke the seal and opened it. My father's handwriting was familiar to me in the way that only a parent's handwriting can be. The slight lean of the letters, the way he formed his lowercase b, the full stops he pressed a little harder than necessary. Reading his words felt like hearing his voice from a room I could no longer enter. The letter was clear and precise. 3 paragraphs written with the kind of deliberate simplicity that meant he had thought carefully about every sentence. He wrote that both of his children were to inherit equally from his estate, in specific proportions he named explicitly, covering both the property and the financial holdings. He wrote that he had discussed this with Mr. Hargrove, and that the will reflected this intent. The second paragraph was the one that stopped my breath for a moment. He wrote that he was aware of tensions and that he wanted the record to be clear. He wrote that any attempt by either party to distort, conceal, or manipulate the terms of his estate would be contrary to his explicit wishes and should be treated accordingly by the solicitor managing the process. He wrote it gently, but there was no mistaking what he meant or who he was thinking about when he wrote it. In the third paragraph he wrote simply, "Clara will be okay. I made sure of it." The same 6 words he had said to me at his bedside. He had known. He had seen what Andrew was capable of, and he had prepared a document specifically to counter it. My father had protected me. Even after he was gone. I called Andrew that evening. I had thought about waiting but decided against it. I wanted to hear his voice when he realized the situation had changed. Not for satisfaction. For information. The way a person responds when they realize they've been caught tells you everything about how far they thought they were going to get. He answered on the third ring. Casual. Confident. Clara, he said. My name in his mouth like a minor inconvenience. I spoke to Mr. Hargrove, I said. The pause that followed was small but significant. Just a half-beat too long. And, he said finally. He showed me Dad's letter, I said. The notarist one. The one you didn't mention when you were explaining how Dad had made his wishes clear. Silence. Then Andrew said something that told me everything I needed to know about where his head was. You should have just taken the check, he said. Not what letter? Not, I don't know what you're talking about. Not even an attempt to explain or reframe. Just, you should have just taken the check. It was the sentence of a person who had been hoping the other party would accept a smaller outcome so nobody had to look too closely at the method used to create it. His voice had shifted slightly. The boredom was gone. For the first time since the porch, Andrew sounded unsure. After that phone call, Andrew's silence ended completely. He called me 4 times the following morning. I watched the screen each time and let it ring through. He left 2 voicemails. The first was controlled. He said he wanted to talk, that things had been handled poorly in the immediate aftermath of the funeral, that he was open to having a proper conversation. His voice was measured and reasonable, the voice of someone who had decided that negotiation was the next available strategy. The second voicemail was less controlled. He said that dragging the estate process out would be expensive and difficult for both of us. He said lawyers cost money. He said Dad wouldn't have wanted this. The irony of him invoking what our father would have wanted was not lost on me. He also sent 3 text messages over the following 2 days. The progression of them was telling. The first asked to meet for coffee. The second said there was clearly a misunderstanding that could be resolved. The third said he hoped I wasn't making a decision I would regret. That last one I forwarded directly to Mr. Hargrove with a note asking him to add it to the file. Because here was what Andrew hadn't understood yet. When he was making the calls and sending the texts and offering to talk things through, the formal process had already begun. Mr. Hargrove had initiated a conduct review. Every message Andrew sent was now going into a record that he could no longer shape or manage. He was used to controlling the narrative. He didn't know how to operate outside it. Mr. Hargrove filed the formal review request on a Monday morning. He called to let me know it had been submitted and to explain what it meant in practical terms. The estate could not be finalized while the review was active. Andrew's assumed sole authority over the estate assets was suspended pending the outcome. Any transactions he had initiated or planned were effectively frozen until the process concluded. I asked how long it would take. Mr. Hargrove said these things varied, but given that the documentation was clear and the key evidence was already within the estate file, he expected a relatively efficient process. The letter, the clause, the conduct record, the timeline, they formed a coherent and well-documented picture. He also said something else. I should tell you that I will be providing a statement about my own communications with Andrew during this period. It has become apparent to me that I was given a selective account of the estate situation in my early dealings with your brother. That is relevant to the review and I intend to make it part of the formal record. Thanked him. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Andrew had controlled every room he had walked into during this process. He had briefed relatives, managed information, presented himself as the organized and reasonable person handling a difficult situation, while quietly removing my access and preparing to hand himself everything. He could not control Mr. Hargrove's office. He could not control what the document said. And he could not control a formal process that operated on evidence rather than presentation. For the first time since the porch, Andrew could not manage what was coming next. The inconsistencies in Andrew's account became visible as the formal review progressed. Mr. Hargrove shared with me, in appropriate terms, some of what the review was surfacing. Andrew had represented to the solicitor's office in an early communication that the estate was straightforward and that both beneficiaries had been briefed and were in agreement about the process. This was demonstrably untrue, as evidenced by my own contact with the office immediately after and the account I had provided. He had also represented that the additional documents in the estate file were purely administrative and had already been shared with all relevant parties. The notarist letter disproved this directly. The timeline of the digital access removals was noted. The pre-death activity at the house, corroborated by Mrs. Okonkwo's account, which I had provided in written form, was included. And the voicemails and text messages, which I had forwarded to Mr. Hargrove and which now sat in the formal file, showed that Andrew's response to the review being initiated was to apply pressure rather than to provide clarification. Each piece was individually explainable. Together, they told a story that was harder to argue against. I watched it unravel from a distance, because I wasn't in those rooms or on those calls. I was at BA's flat drinking tea and going to work and living a normal day while the machinery of a proper process did what proper processes do when they have good material to work with. But I found myself wondering whether it would be enough. Evidence and truth were not always the same thing as outcome. Andrew made his final move on a Wednesday afternoon. Mr. Hargrove called to let me know. Andrew had submitted a proposal through his own solicitor, a revised offer, substantially more than the check he had handed me on the porch. Still not the equal share my father's letter described, but significantly more than before. The accompanying note, relayed through Mr. Hargrove, said that Andrew was prepared to resolve the matter privately and avoid a prolonged formal process. He said the offer was generous and time-limited. He said it was in everyone's interest to reach a conclusion without further cost or complication. Mr. Hargrove read it to me carefully and then waited. I almost smiled. Not with pleasure exactly. With a kind of recognition. Andrew had gone from handing me a dismissal check on the porch, to calling 4 times in one morning, to offering a revised amount through a formal channel. Each stage of his position had shifted not because he had developed a conscience but because the ground beneath him kept changing and he was trying to find something solid to stand on. He wanted to negotiate now because negotiation meant the full truth stayed contained. A private settlement meant no formal ruling. No formal ruling meant no official record of what he had done. I told Mr. Hargrove to decline. I don't want more money than he's offering, I said. I want what my father said I was entitled to. And I want it through the proper process. There was a brief pause. Understood, Mr. Hargrove said. We proceed. The formal hearing was a Thursday morning in a room that was smaller and less dramatic than I had imagined. A conference-style setup rather than a courtroom. A mediating officer appointed by the estate court. Mr. Hargrove on one side. Andrew's solicitor, a man named Mr. Ife, on the other. Andrew sat across the table from me for the first time since the porch. I had thought about this moment a great deal over the preceding weeks. I had wondered whether seeing him would bring back the anger that had driven the early days of all this. Whether sitting across from someone who had planned to erase me while standing at our father's grave would produce something volcanic and unmanageable. Didn't. What I felt, looking at Andrew, was something much quieter than anger. A kind of clarity. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. He was the same height and build he had always been. But smaller in some other way that I didn't have a precise word for. He met my eyes briefly when I sat down, then looked at the documents in front of him. His solicitor made an opening statement that was measured and professional and described a version of events that bore very little resemblance to what had actually happened. I listened to it without reacting. Then Mr. Hargrove began. The documents came out in order. The will, letter, clause, timeline, the evidence of access removal, Mrs. Okonkwo's written account, the communications record. The mediating officer reviewed each item in silence. Andrew sat very still. The ruling came at the end of the second session, 1 week after the first. The mediating officer's finding was clear. Andrew had withheld material information from a co-beneficiary. He had misrepresented the estate terms to third parties. He had taken actions to limit the other beneficiaries' access to information and records prior to any formal estate process being initiated. These actions fell within the conduct provision explicitly included in the estate documentation. His sole control over the estate was revoked. The estate was to be reopened and administered in full accordance with the will and the notarized letter, with equal shares distributed as my father had specified. An independent administrator would oversee the remaining process to ensure appropriate handling. The check Andrew had handed me on the porch, that small, insulting amount, was formally noted in the record as inconsistent with the estate terms and without legal validity as a settlement. I sat and listened to all of it without reacting visibly. Inside, something settled. Not the triumphant settling of someone who has won something they wanted. The quieter, more solid settling of someone who has been told by an official process that the truth they already knew was, in fact, the truth. My father had written that I would be okay. He had made sure of it. He had been right. But I knew this wasn't quite finished. The ruling was the formal outcome. What came next was something different. The consequences arrived in pieces over the following weeks. Andrew's credibility within the family collapsed almost immediately once the formal finding became known. Mr. Hargrove had shared the outcome with both parties, and in a family that had accepted Andrew's version of events so readily, the official reversal of that version landed with considerable force. My Aunt Phyllis called me, then Felix, then Auntie Bev. The conversations were not comfortable. People who had stood back and accepted Andrew's narrative were now reckoning with what their silence had permitted. Some of them were sorry. Some of them were more focused on understanding what had happened than on the impact it had on me. All of them had realized, too late, that they had been given one side of a story and had not thought to ask for the other. Andrew's professional reputation sustained its own damage. The formal finding was a matter of record. His solicitor had advised him through a process that had ended with an official determination that he had withheld information and misrepresented estate terms. In the circles where my brother operated, that kind of record did not stay quiet. He did not call me again after the ruling was issued. The same people who had stood inside while I knocked on the porch, who had eaten sandwiches and listened to Andrew speak and accepted his version of our father's wishes, now faced the knowledge of what they had participated in. Not through sympathy for me. Through the simple, hard clarity of the truth. Several weeks after the ruling, I stood outside the house on Aldwell Road again. This time I had a key in my hand. Not because I had been handed it and told I could stay. Because the estate process had been completed correctly, with both beneficiaries' interests properly administered, and I had made a decision about what I wanted to do with my portion. I stood on the pavement for a moment before going in. The last time I had stood at this door, Andrew had been on the other side of it, calm and organized and certain that he had arranged everything before I arrived. The suitcase on the porch, the check in his hand, the door locking behind me. He had tried to make me into someone who had no claim, no standing. No right to the things my father had specifically made sure would be mine. He had built an entire structure to make that story true. The relatives briefed in advance, the digital access removed, the documents kept from me, the narrative circulated through the family before I had a single opportunity to speak. And the structure had collapsed. Not because I had been louder or more dramatic or because I had made a scene on any doorstep, but because my father had been careful. And because I had been patient. And because the truth, when properly documented and properly presented to a process designed to receive it, did not require anyone's permission to stand. I put the key in the lock and opened the door. I didn't rush inside. I just stood in the doorway for a moment and let the house be what it was. My father's. Real. He had tried to erase me. Instead, he had only managed to expose himself.